Frost crusted his beard like river ice. He had not spoken to a living soul since October. Hadn't it needed to, just wind scraping against the pines and the dull rhythm of his axe. Then her bay mare dropped dead in his clearing, turning his quiet, frozen world completely inside out. Hiram did not love the mountain. Men who claimed to love the high country usually died in it, betrayed by their own romantic notions. He respected it. He feared it just enough to stay sharp, and he survived it by mirroring its indifference. The morning the sky broke open, the mercury sat well below zero. It was a particular cold, the kind of high country freeze that tightens the lungs and makes pine bark snap with the sound of a pistol shot. Hiram pushed open the heavy timber door of his cabin. The hinges shrieked. He stepped out onto the packed snow of the porch, exhaling a plume of white breath that hung in the still air before dissipating. He moved with the stiff, methodical grace of a man who had broken half the bones in his body over 54 years of hard living. His hands, gripping the wooden rail, were entirely calloused, the knuckles swollen, the skin like cured leather. He did not wear gloves to check the weather. You needed to feel the bite of the air to judge its temper. Today it bit deep. Down in the draw the creek was mostly frozen over, but in the quiet of the morning Hiram could hear it. The sound of water running under ice. It was a hollow, choked gurgle, scraping against the frozen banks, fighting for every inch of downstream progress. He turned back inside. The stove needed feeding. His cabin was a single room, built from felled lodgepole pines, chinked with mud and horsehair. It smelled of wood smoke, rendered tallow and old wool. Everything had a purpose. The cast-iron skillet hung precisely on its nail. The trapping gear rested in the corner, neatly oiled chains coiled tight. Above the door, on 2 wooden pegs, rested his rifle. Hiram lifted the rifle down. The weight of the heavy octagonal barrel and the walnut stock settled familiarly against his shoulder. He checked the action, smooth. He wiped a microscopic speck of dust from the breech, thumbed a heavy cartridge into the chamber, and snapped it shut. Breakfast was salted pork and beans, cooked down to a paste, eaten from a tin plate with a wooden spoon. He ate without tasting, fueling the machine of his body. Out here you didn't eat for pleasure, you ate to generate heat. By sunrise he was out on the ridge. He walked his trapline with a heavy, snow-muffled tread. The timber stretched endlessly in every direction, a stark, jagged ocean of dark green against blinding white. No tracks, no movement, just the absolute, suffocating silence of deep winter isolation. It was a silence that drove lesser men to conversation with trees, to madness. Hiram just let it sit in his ears. It was better than the noise of the settlements. Better than the shouting, the bargaining, the lying. The mountain never lied. When it wanted you dead, it simply sent a storm. He checked the first 3 snares, empty. He reset a trigger mechanism on the 4th, his bare fingers working quickly, expertly, ignoring the numbing sting of the iron. He was kneeling in the snow, brushing powder over a steel jaw when he felt it. He didn't hear it first. He felt the vibration through the hard-packed earth beneath the snow, a heavy, erratic thudding. Hiram went perfectly still. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung across his back. He brought it forward, the worn stock finding its groove against his collarbone. He thumbed the hammer back halfway. He waited. His eyes, pale and flinty, scanned the tree line below. A shape emerged from the dense gray timber. A horse, a bay mare, lathered in frozen sweat, stumbling through drifts that reached her chest. Hiram narrowed his eyes. Nobody came up this ridge in January. Nobody who knew what they were doing, anyway. The horse lunged forward, fighting the snow, its head low, eyes rolling with exhaustion. Astride the saddle was a slumped figure, wrapped in a heavy, oversized buffalo coat, listing dangerously to the left. Hiram didn't call out. He didn't wave his arms. He simply watched, calculating. If they kept on their current trajectory, they would cross the edge of his clearing. If the horse fell down there in the gully, they would freeze before noon. The decision was taken out of his hands. The mare hit a hidden rock beneath the drift. Her front legs buckled. She went down with a heavy, groaning impact, throwing the rider sideways into the powder. The horse thrashed for a moment, kicking up a cloud of white, then gave a long, shuddering exhale. Her head dropped. She didn't move again. The rider lay a few yards away, a dark heap against the snow. Hiram lowered his rifle. He stood there for a long minute. A smart man would walk away. A smart man wouldn't invite the troubles of the world into a camp that was meant to keep the world out. He sighed, the breath plumbing violently in the cold. He eased the hammer down on the rifle and started the long, difficult descent toward the clearing. The snow in the gully was waist deep. Hiram waded through it, using his rifle as a balance pole, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. The wind was picking up, lifting loose powder and throwing it in sharp, stinging sheets across the open ground. He reached the horse first, dead. Heart gave out. He placed a hand on the mare's neck. Still warm, but cooling fast. He turned his attention to the rider. The figure was completely still, half buried in the snow thrown up by the fall. Hiram knelt. He grabbed the shoulder of the buffalo coat and hauled the person onto their back. A heavy wool scarf obscured the lower half of the face. A slouch hat, jammed down tight, covered the rest. Hiram reached out, his rough, calloused fingers catching the edge of the scarf. He pulled it down. A woman. She was young, much younger than he was, maybe 25. Her skin was the color of skim milk, tinged with a dangerous, translucent blue around the lips and eyelids. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with frozen sweat. Hiram felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. A man dying in the snow was one thing. A young woman was a complication he hadn't planned for and didn't want. He pulled off his thick right mitten, tucking it under his arm. He pressed 2 thick fingers against her throat, right below the jawline. The pulse was there, faint, fluttering like a trapped moth, but there. "Damn it," he muttered, the words swallowed instantly by the wind. He didn't waste time trying to wake her. The cold was already setting into her bones. She needed fire. He grabbed her under the arms, hoisting her up. She was dead awake, heavy with the massive coat and the encroaching freeze. Hiram grunted, his boots slipping in the powder as he found his footing. The trek back up the ridge to the cabin took 40 minutes. Should have taken 10. Every step was a brutal negotiation with gravity and snow. His muscles burned, screaming in protest, but he set a rhythm. Step, drag, breathe, step, breathe. He didn't look at her face again. He just focused on the timber door of his cabin, a small brown square in a world of blinding white. When he finally shouldered the door open, he practically fell inside, dragging her with him. He kicked the door shut behind them, sealing out the howling wind. The cabin was marginally warmer than outside, the iron stove radiating a low, steady heat. Hiram dragged her onto the braided rug in front of the hearth. He dropped to his knees, his own breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He didn't rest. Hypothermia didn't wait for a man to catch his breath. He began stripping away her outer layers. The buffalo coat was stiff with ice. He worked the bone toggles loose with clumsy, freezing fingers, peeling the heavy hide away. Beneath it, she wore a man's flannel shirt, far too large for her, and thick canvas trousers. Her boots were the worst. The leather was frozen solid to her woolen socks. Hiram took his hunting knife from his belt. He didn't bother trying to unlace them. He carefully sliced down the side of the leather, pulling the ruined boots off her feet. He cut the frozen socks away next. Her toes were white, hard as marble. He worked quickly, stoking the stove, adding fresh, dry kindling until the iron belly roared. He pulled his own woolen blankets from the cot, wrapping them tightly around her shivering form. He fetched a bucket of snow from the porch and set it on the stove to melt. You never put frozen skin near direct heat. It would cook the flesh from the inside out. He needed tepid water. For the next 2 hours, he sat on the floor beside her. He took her frozen feet in his large, rough hands, pressing them against his own stomach beneath his shirt, letting his core heat slowly bleed into her extremities. He didn't look at her face. He just stared at the iron stove, listening to the crackle of the wood and the shallow, ragged intake of her breath. It was an intimate, necessary violence, this forcing of life back into a body that had started to let go. Around noon, her eyelids fluttered. A soft, agonizing moan escaped her lips as the blood began to painfully circulate back into her limbs. Hiram pulled his shirt down, carefully placing her wrapped feet back on the rug. He stood up, moving to the stove to pour a tin cup of lukewarm water. When he turned back, her eyes were open. They were dark, darker than the surrounding pines at dusk, and they were wide with a feral, immediate panic. She scrambled backward, the blankets tangling around her legs, her back hitting the rough timber wall of the cabin. Her hand flew to her waist, searching for a holster that wasn't there. Hiram didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, holding the tin cup, his large frame blocking the only exit. "You're in my cabin," he said. His voice was gravelly, unused to forming words. It sounded loud in the small space. She stared at him, her chest heaving. She took in his size, his scarred face, the sheer wild unkemptness of him. Her eyes darted to the rifle resting by the door, then back to his hands. "My horse," she rasped. Her voice was cracked, raw. "Dead," Hiram said flatly. She flinched. Not a dramatic collapse, just a sharp physical tightening of her jaw. She looked down at her bare feet, then at the ruined boots near the stove. "Drink this," Hiram said. He took a slow step forward and held out the cup. She didn't reach for it. She pressed harder against the wall. "Who are you?" "Name's Hiram, and you're trespassing. But seeing as you were mostly dead 20 yards from my porch, I made an exception." He set the cup on a small wooden crate between them and backed away. She looked at the cup, then at him. Slowly, her hand emerged from the blankets. It was shaking violently. She grasped the tin, bringing it to her lips, never taking her dark eyes off him. She drank. Hiram walked over to his chair by the window and sat heavily. He had picked up a piece of harness leather and a scraping knife. He began to work the leather, the rhythmic shh of the blade filling the silence. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask who she was running from. Up here, everyone was running from something. He just kept scraping the leather, waiting for the mountain to decide what happened next. It took 3 days for Josephine to fully regain her footing. 3 days of a stifling, heavy silence inside the one-room cabin. Outside, the blizzard that had caught her on the ridge raged without pause, burying the world in a featureless white tomb. The cabin was no larger than 16 by 20 feet. For a man accustomed to having an entire mountain range to himself, another living, breathing person in his space felt like a rock in a boot. Every movement had to be calculated. Every sound was magnified. Hiram kept his routine. He woke in the pitch black, stoked the fire, boiled coffee, and sat by the frosted window, staring out at the driving snow. He left the cabin only to fetch wood from the lean-to, a task he accomplished with brutal efficiency, returning covered in snow, smelling of pine resin and cold iron. Josephine claimed the small cot in the corner. For the first 2 days, she mostly slept, her body fighting the deep exhaustion of near freezing. When she was awake, she watched him. She didn't watch him with the nervous fluttering of a frightened girl. She watched him the way a trapped fox watches a hound, calculating, evaluating, measuring the distance between them, measuring his speed, measuring the weight of his footfalls. Hiram felt her gaze, though he never acknowledged it. He knew what she was seeing, an old man. Gray in the beard, deep lines carved around the eyes, moving with a stiff hitch in his left knee. He knew he looked entirely wild. He had no illusions about himself. He was an ugly man, made uglier by a hard life. On the third morning, the wind finally died. The silence that followed the storm was absolute, a heavy pressure against the eardrums. Hiram was at the stove, frying a meager portion of venison tallow and cornmeal. He heard the rustle of wool behind him. He didn't turn. He just kept his eyes on the sizzling pan. "I can do that," a voice said. It was the first time she had spoken unprompted since she woke up. Her voice was smoother now, the raw rasp gone. It held a low, steady cadence. Hiram slowly scraped the spatula against the iron. "You can barely stand." "I can stand fine." He heard the creak of the floorboards. She stepped up beside him. She was wearing her oversized flannel shirt and her thick trousers. She was still pale, but the dangerous blue had faded from her lips. She smelled faintly of old sweat and wood smoke. She reached out and took the handle of the spatula from his hand. Hiram let it go. He stepped back, giving her space. "I'm not dead weight," she said, her eyes fixed on the pan. "I don't expect a free ride." "Nobody gets a free ride up here," Hiram said. "Mountain doesn't take IOUs." "My name is Josephine," she said, flipping the hardened cake of cornmeal. "I didn't ask." She shot him a sideways glance. "I know you didn't. You haven't asked anything." "Ain't my business." Most men would be full of questions. A woman, alone, pushing a horse to death in a January blizzard. Hiram walked over to his chair and sat down, picking up his rifle to check the action again. It was a nervous habit, one he rarely indulged, but her presence was making his hands itch for something familiar to hold. "Most men are fools," Hiram said, staring down the barrel. "A person runs out into a storm like that, they're either profoundly stupid, or they're running from something worse than freezing to death. Either way, asking about it just brings the trouble through my front door." Josephine slid the cornmeal cake onto a tin plate. She brought it over and set it on the small table next to him. She didn't retreat to her corner. She stood there, her arms crossed over her chest. "I'm not stupid," she said quietly. Hiram looked up at her. Really looked at her for the first time since he pulled the scarf from her face. She had a hard set to her jaw. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, held a defiant edge, but beneath it there was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She wasn't a saloon girl, and she wasn't some wealthy rancher's pampered daughter. Her hands, resting on her arms, had dirt worked deep into the cuticles, and a jagged, raised scar ran across the back of her left thumb. "Never said you were," Hiram muttered, looking back down at his rifle. "I need to get to the railhead at Olathe," she said. Hiram let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. It sounded like a dry cough. Olathe is 60 miles south over the pass. The pass is choked with 10 feet of drift snow. You ain't getting to Olathe until the thaw. When is the thaw? April. Maybe May, if the mountain stays stubborn. Josephine stared at him. He watched her process the information. There were no tears, no histrionics, just a slow, tight clench of her jaw muscles. "Then I guess I'm here until May," she said flatly. Hiram stood up. He towered over her, his broad shoulders blocking out the pale light from the window. "This ain't a boarding house. I got provisions for one man, barely enough to stretch till spring. I don't have the food, I don't have the space, and I sure as hell don't have the patience to babysit a stray." She didn't flinch. She tilted her head back to look him in the eye. "I said I'm not dead weight. I can shoot, I can skin, I can set a snare. I don't eat much. You don't know the first thing about surviving this ridge." "Then you'll teach me," she countered smoothly. Hiram scoffed, turning away to grab his heavy coat from the peg. "I work alone." "You live alone," she corrected. "There's a difference." He stopped, his hand on the heavy iron latch of the door. He looked back at her. She stood her ground, a small, solitary figure in the center of his fiercely guarded isolation. "Keep the fire hot," he growled, pulling the door open. "I'm going to see if your dead horse brought any wolves down into the gully." He stepped out into the blinding glare of the morning snow, pulling the door shut behind him with a heavy thud. Outside the air was still, painfully cold. The glare off the fresh snow was blinding. Hiram pulled his hat down low over his eyes and began breaking a trail toward the ridge edge. His mind was a tangled knot. He liked his silence. He liked his cold, predictable world. Josephine was a variable he couldn't control. She was sharp, observant, and dangerously unbothered by his gruffness. He reached the overlook. Down in the draw, a mound of snow marked the grave of the bay mare. He scanned the tree line. Nothing. No tracks. The storm had wiped the slate clean. He leaned against a massive pine, letting the cold seep into his back. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with disgust at his scarred face or his ragged clothes, just an intense, focused appraisal. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the pristine snow. "Damn it," he whispered to the empty timber. When he returned to the cabin an hour later, carrying 2 frozen rabbits he'd pulled from his traps, the smell of fresh coffee hit him before he even opened the door. He stepped inside, kicking the snow from his boots. The cabin was warm. The floor had been swept. The rusted tin mugs had been scrubbed clean with sand. Josephine was sitting on the wooden chair by the stove, meticulously unspooling a tangled length of his fishing line. She looked up as he entered. "Any wolves?" she asked. "No," Hiram grunted, tossing the frozen rabbits onto the table. "Just meat. I'll skin them," she said, setting the line down and reaching for her own small knife. Hiram watched her. She moved with a quiet, deliberate efficiency. She didn't ask for permission. She just saw work that needed doing and did it. He unbuttoned his heavy coat, the ice cracking off the wool. "You skin 'em," he said slowly. "You don't ruin the pelts. I sell those in the spring." "I won't ruin them," she replied, not looking up. Hiram walked to the corner and sat on the edge of his cot. He watched the firelight dance across the rough timber walls, feeling the strange, heavy shift in the atmosphere of the room. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was stretched tight, thrumming with an unspoken negotiation. 2 survivors circled around a small iron stove, waiting to see who would break first. Stories survive because we gather to hear them. Out here in the cold, a good tale keeps the frostbite at bay. If you found some warmth in this cabin today, leave a like and share this with someone who appreciates a grounded Western. Subscribe to the channel. Pull up a chair to our digital campfire, and let's keep this tradition alive. We will see what tomorrow brings for these 2 stubborn souls. The fire is always burning right in here. February was not a month on the ridge. It was a physical weight. It pressed down on the roof beams, testing the load-bearing joints, freezing the sap in the pines until they popped in the dead of night like artillery fire. Inside the cabin, the space between Hiram and Josephine shrank. It was a mathematical inevitability. 2 bodies, 16 by 20 feet, trapped by snowdrifts taller than a man on horseback. They did not talk of their pasts. Hiram did not ask what chased her up the mountain in a January squall. Josephine did not ask how he got the deep, jagged scar tracing his jawline, or why a man his age chose to rot in the high timber instead of sitting by a hearth in a valley town. They communicated through labor. Hiram noticed the small things. The way she never wasted a scrap of fat when dressing a rabbit. The precise, economical movements of her hands when she re-stitched a torn snowshoe binding using boiled sinew. She did not complain about the cold. She did not sigh heavily when the fire needed stoking at 3 in the morning. She simply pulled on her boots, broke the ice in the water bucket, and did the work. A quiet, grudging respect took root in his chest. It was a dangerous thing, respect. It meant you started caring whether a person lived or died, and out here, caring was a liability. The breaking point arrived in the second week of March. The wind had been screaming for 2 days, a relentless, tearing gale that stripped dead branches from the canopy. Hiram was out near the tree line, hacking away at a fallen lodgepole to replenish their dwindling cordwood. The air was a blinding haze of suspended ice crystals. He swung the axe, the heavy iron head biting deep into the frozen grain. He wrenched the handle to split the round. He never heard the branch fall. The wind swallowed the crack. A dead limb, thick as a man's thigh, sheared off a towering pine directly above him. It fell 60 feet. It struck him a glancing blow across the right shoulder and collarbone. A massive, concussive impact that drove him face first into the packed snow. The world went violently white, then a sickening shade of gray. Hiram lay in the powder, his lungs paralyzed. He tried to push himself up with his right arm. Nothing happened. The limb was entirely dead, hanging uselessly in its socket, a jagged spike of agony radiating from his shoulder blade down to his fingertips. He rolled onto his back, biting his lip until he tasted iron, fighting the wave of nausea. Dislocated, maybe broken. Out here, the difference was academic. A one-armed man in the high timber was a dead man. He staggered to his feet, using the axe handle as a crutch with his left hand. The wind battered him, threatening to push him back into the drift. Every step toward the cabin was an exercise in localized torture. His breathing came in shallow, ragged hisses. When he shouldered the heavy timber door open and fell into the room, Joe's glass dropped the heavy iron skillet she was scrubbing. It hit the floorboards with a deafening clatter. She didn't scream. She crossed the room in 3 strides. "Chair," she ordered, grabbing his good arm and hauling his heavy frame toward the seat by the stove. Hiram collapsed into it, his head swimming. He watched her through half-closed eyes. She didn't flutter. She didn't ask what happened. She saw the unnatural slump of his right shoulder, the tear in his heavy wool coat, the pale, clammy sheen of shock on his face. She stripped his coat off, using her small skinning knife to cut the sleeve rather than drag the heavy wool over the joint. She sliced his flannel shirt down the seam. The cold air hit his bare skin. His shoulder was a grotesque, swollen lump, the head of the humerus sitting visibly forward of the socket. "It's out," she said. Her voice was flat, clinical. "I know," Hiram gritted out. "You have to put it back." She looked at his shoulder, then at his face. Her dark eyes were perfectly steady. "I've seen this done on horses, never a man. Mechanics are the same. Pull out, rotate, push in." He clamped his left hand onto the wooden armrest of the chair, his knuckles turning bone-white. "Do it!" Josephine didn't hesitate. She stepped between his knees to gain leverage. She took his heavy, calloused right wrist in both of her hands. "I need you to breathe out," she said softly. Hiram inhaled a shuddering breath. "Just pull." She pulled. The pain was an absolute blinding entity. It tore through his vision, stealing the breath from his lungs. He felt the grinding of cartilage, the sickening pop of the bone clearing the edge of the socket, the terrible, terrible tension of the stretched muscles snapping back into place. He blacked out for 2 seconds. When his vision cleared, he was slumped forward, his forehead resting against Josephine's stomach. She was holding his head, her fingers woven tightly into his graying hair, her breathing as heavy and erratic as his own. The shoulder was back in. The agony had receded to a deep, throbbing ache. He didn't move. He kept his head pressed against her, smelling the wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of lye soap on her clothes. For a man who had not been touched with anything resembling care in 2 decades, the sensation was profoundly unraveling. She gently pushed him back, her hand sliding down his good arm. She grabbed a strip of canvas from her sewing kit and began to fashion a sling. "You're out of commission," she stated, tying the knot tight behind his neck. "I can chop with my left," he mumbled, a weak attempt at defiance. "You'll sit," she corrected, stepping back. "I run the trap line starting tomorrow." Hiram looked at her, really looked at her. Her face was flushed from the exertion, her jaw set with that same stubborn, unyielding granite he had seen the day she woke up. he didn't argue. He leaned his head back against the chair and closed his eyes. He had spent his entire life building walls to keep the world out. But watching her turn back to the stove, he realized the terrifying truth. She was already inside. Spring in the high country did not arrive with a gentle warming. It came violently. Late April brought torrential rain that turned the snowpack into a rotting, treacherous slush. The creek in the draw, silent for months, became a roaring, muddy torrent that tore away the banks and dragged entire pines down the mountain. The air smelled of wet earth, decomposing leaves and raw, unfiltered sunlight. Hiram's shoulder had healed to a stiff, functional ache. He could use the axe again, though the swing was slower, more deliberate. The thaw meant one thing. The pass to Olathe was open. He knew it. She knew it. They moved around the cabin in a heavy, suffocating silence, the unspoken reality hanging between them like a drawn knife. On a Tuesday morning, the mud on the trail leading south had finally baked solid enough to walk on. Hiram sat at the small wooden table. He had laid out a canvas pack. He was methodically loading it. 5 pounds of cured venison jerky, a small sack of cornmeal, a tin of matches, his spare hunting knife, the blade freshly honed. He packed with aggressive precision, keeping his eyes firmly on the canvas. Josephine stood by the open door, watching the tree line. The air was warm, alive with the sound of nesting jays. "That's a lot of jerky," she observed. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual edge. "Olathe is a long walk," Hiram said gruffly. He shoved the cornmeal into the bottom of the sack and cinched the leather strap hard. "Trail's clear. Mud's dried up enough. You leave tomorrow at first light. 2 days hard walking, you'll hit the railhead." He didn't look up. He couldn't. If he looked at her, he would see the dark hair falling across her forehead, the capable set of her shoulders, the way she had carved out a space in this miserable Frob's fox and made it feel like something entirely different. He would see everything he was about to lose. He pushed the pack across the table. "Take my second canteen. Water in the valley is alkali this time of year." Josephine walked slowly over to the table. She didn't touch the pack. She looked down at his hands, scarred, battered, resting flat on the rough-hewn wood. "You want me gone," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I want you alive," Hiram corrected, finally raising his eyes. "You came up here running. The pass is open. Time to keep running." "I'm done running." Hiram let out a harsh, scraped breath. He pushed his chair back and stood up, the chair legs screaming against the floorboards. He needed space. He walked to the cold stove, turning his back on her. "This ain't a life, Josephine. It's a holding pattern. I sleep on a cot in a shack that smells like wet dog and old blood. I eat what I kill. I freeze 9 months out of the year, and if I break my leg up here, the crows eat my eyes before the snow melts." "I know what this life is," she replied, her voice steady, anchoring the room. "I've lived it for 4 months." "You survived it for 4 months," he snapped, turning to face her. The frustration was boiling over, masking the terror beneath it. "You're 25 years old. You got a whole life down in that valley, towns, people, a future. You go down there, you find a younger man, a man who ain't broken in half, a man who can give you a parlor and a glass window." He stepped toward her, his pale, flinty eyes fierce, trying to scare her away, trying to use his own roughness as a weapon. "Look at me," he demanded, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "I am a scarred-up, ugly, stubborn old bastard. I got no money, I got no manners, and my best years are rotting in the dirt. You're too young for an old mountain man. You stay up here, I'll just drag you down into the dirt with me." Josephine did not step back. She held his gaze. She didn't flinch at the volume, at the physical imposition of his massive frame, or at the bitter truth of his words. She reached out. Her hand, calloused from chopping wood, scarred from the skinning knife, covered his thick, bruised knuckles resting on the edge of the table. Her touch was warm, deliberate, heavy with absolute certainty. She looked at his scarred face, reading the lines carved by isolation, the defensive set of his jaw, the deep, exhausted loneliness hiding behind his pale eyes. She saw the man who had pulled her frozen body from a snowbank, the man who had given up his own heat to keep her alive, the man who trusted her to set his bones back into place. She didn't see a broken old man. She saw a foundation. She saw the only solid thing she had ever encountered in a world built on lies. "I've had a parlor," Josephine whispered, her voice low, cutting through his defensive bluster like a straight razor. "I've had men with manners. They smile at you while they lock the door from the outside." She stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. She did not look at him with pity, nor with starry-eyed romanticism. She looked at him with the raw, assessing gaze of a survivor who had finally found an equal. "I don't want a glass window," she said, her thumb tracing the swollen joint of his knuckle. "I want a man who doesn't lie. I want a man who knows exactly how cold the world is and still keeps the fire lit." Hiram stared at her, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling heavily. The walls he had spent 2 decades building were failing, crumbling under the quiet weight of her presence. "Josephine," he started, the word catching in his throat. She squeezed his hand, stopping his retreat. "You think you're broken," she whispered, looking up into his guarded eyes, stating it as an unshakable fact. "But to me, you're perfect." The silence in the cabin was no longer oppressive. It was expansive. It was the sound of the timber settling into a new foundation. Hiram looked down at the canvas pack on the table, loaded with provisions for a departure that was no longer happening. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his hand out from under hers. For a second, a flash of apprehension crossed her eyes. Then Hiram reached out and grasped the canvas strap of the pack. He picked it up, walked over to the corner, and tossed it unceremoniously onto his empty cot. He turned back to her. The fierce, defensive scowl had melted away, leaving only the rugged, tired, honest face of a man who had finally stopped fighting the tide. "We need more cordwood," he said quietly, his voice lacking any of its former gravel. "Spring nights still freeze." Josephine's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile breaking the hard lines of her face. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her leather work gloves. "I'll get the axe," she said. Hiram watched her walk toward the door, the sunlight catching the dark shine of her hair. He felt the dull ache in his shoulder, the stiffness in his bad knee, the heavy reality of the unforgiving mountain pressing against the timber walls. But as he followed her out into the bright, muddy clearing, the cold wind hitting his face didn't feel like a threat anymore. It just felt like breathing.